Hey guys, it's Mr. Irving again. We're going to go through part two, the last little bit of our chapter 27 slideshow. So we're going to start off on Philippines insurrection and get through the end. We only have about 10 slides to do, so it shouldn't take us too long. So let's go ahead and get started. So last time when we left off, we kind of left with this idea, or this question of what are we going to do about the Philippines? Well, we decided to make them our colony. We forced them into being Christian, we forced them to learn English, and as you can imagine, a lot of the Filipinos did not appreciate this. They did not enjoy that at all. One of these people in particular was Emilio Aguinaldo. Emilio was a Filipino revolutionary and a politician. He's going to later be recognized as the very first president of the Philippines. Now, at first, he will lead his people against Spain. So during the Filipino insurrection against Spain, he'll lead in that. He'll fight against the Spanish again during the Spanish-American War. That leg of Spanish-American War that still happened in the Philippines, he's still fighting against the Spanish. And then eventually, when the United States comes, he will lead his people against the United States. Now, eventually, he will be captured by the United States, and that will end his presidency. He's forced to give up and make his people stop fighting. But the whole time it lasted, he won't get captured until 1901, towards the end. He leads a brutal insurrection against the Americans. Now, the tactics used in this insurrection were brutal on both sides. Both the Filipinos and the Americans used some truly terrible stuff. Guerrilla warfare was widespread by the Filipinos, as you can imagine, because they had a smaller force. They were forced to do that. The Americans resorted to torture and used concentration camps against the Filipinos. Very similar stuff to what the Spanish were doing against the Cubans during the Cuban insurrection against the Spanish. So we used the same tactics they did. A couple numbers that I put at the bottom of the slideshow were 20,000, 200,000, and 4,000. What those numbers represent were 20,000 Filipino soldiers were killed, 200,000 Filipino civilians were killed, and then 4,000 American soldiers were killed during this insurrection. So much worse than the Spanish-American War to start with in terms of death on the American side and the Filipino side. Now, those numbers are considered conservative by some historians. Some historians have put the Filipino death toll as high as 1 million. So this is a really brutal piece of Filipino and American history. Now let's go ahead and move on. Next up is China. What is going on with China? Well, foreign powers have been lured into Chinese markets. Both Japan, Western European powers, they all want to push their own separate spheres of influence. China is a big market. There's a lot of potential customers. There's a lot of raw materials. No one really wants to be left out. And the United States very much counts in that. They don't want to be shut out of China because we are an emerging empire. We feel like we need to get control in there as well. So what we're going to do is going to be something called the Open Door Note. This was written in 1899. It was written by the Secretary of State, a guy named John Hay. And he writes this letter to all the other great imperial powers. And he's urging them to keep China open for fair competition, meaning no one just completely takes a big chunk of China and closes it off. Everyone should be allowed to compete for the resources and the customers everywhere. Who agrees with this idea? Pretty much everyone. Russia doesn't really, but they come around to it. Everyone else kind of comes around to the idea of, sure, fair competition, whatever. China's big enough to share. However, one person not asked how they felt was China itself. China is just being carved up by these European powers, and no one asked them how they feel about it or what they want to happen. So as you can imagine, a lot of Chinese are going to have a big problem with this. This is what's going to lead us into the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. Now this is an anti-imperialist uprising by the Chinese. To start with, they're going to kill a lot of the missionaries who are staying there in China. Missionaries make an easy target. They're not usually very violent. They're not going to fight back. But a lot of the Chinese see the missionaries as that first step towards destroying their culture. The missionaries came in, took away their own religion, are trying to get people to be Christian, changing their values to more of these Western values. So the Boxer Rebellion will start with 200 missionaries are killed, and then fighting is going to continue lasting for 55 days. Now, the Chinese government is initially split on if they should support the Boxers or not. Unfortunately for the Chinese, some of the government decides to side with the Boxers. So then eventually, when this rebellion is put down, and it will be put down by an international force, by all the imperial powers, they can put some blame on the Chinese government. So that gives the imperial powers reason to have many of the government officials executed and demanding huge sums of money from China to try to pay for the wrong they've done. Next up, this is a very famous political cartoon of the European powers carving up China. You can see the Chinese official in the back looking like he has no control over this but has strong objections. And then cartoonish representations of all the big powers. And you can even see Lady Liberty looking on from the back as China is being cut up. You might think, why is she in the back? Why is she not actively in the table? She's not the strongest power yet. Remember, she was kind of late in the game, looking on to see what Japan and Western European powers do. Another political cartoon who deals with this in a similar way. You have Uncle Sam, clearly representing the United States. And then that picture, which is probably McKinley, the president at the time. They are carrying a flag into battle against what's represented as the Boxers. So they have some heads on pikes and spears. Those should be the missionaries. You see dead children, a flag being trampled on the ground. Brutal stuff. But also notice the depiction of the Boxers. They look almost inhuman, like zombies. So this political cartoon clearly shows that America is the right side fighting against these savage Boxers. Now, how much truth is in that is up for debate. Okay, let's get out of war and get on to something a little less violent. And that's going to be talking about the election of 1900. So this is a big deal election. It's a rematch of pretty much the election of 1896. The same two guys are the two major powers. So McKinley will once again secure the Republican nomination, and he'll be up against William Jennings Bryan from the Democrats. Now, in terms of the main issue, hopefully you'd be able to guess by now, but it's all about imperialism. McKinley continues to support his imperialistic agenda. He's signed off on the Spanish-American War Treaty. We've gained lots of territories through them. We've annexed Hawaii. So very much pro-imperialism goes for McKinley. William Jennings Bryan is anti-imperialism. As you know, he's a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. So imperialism is the big issue that's debated all the time. And what are the results? Once again, much like in 1896, McKinley is going to win. However, there's going to be some differences. McKinley has to get a new vice president. His vice president from the last term dies of a heart attack. So in steps Teddy Roosevelt, someone the Republicans put in the ticket just to make him really go away. There's no position less powerful than really the vice president. And he's starting to kind of anger and shake up the Republican Party. So the bigwigs and the Republicans say, let's take this very progressive Teddy Roosevelt, stick him under the VP so he can't make noise anymore as governor of New York or as just traveling around and raising issues. Now we're going to talk a lot more about Teddy Roosevelt soon. But next up, McKinley's second term is going to be very, very short indeed because he will be assassinated in September of 1901. A deranged anarchist named Leon, I cannot pronounce his last name, so I won't even try, but Leon is going to shoot McKinley in Buffalo, New York. So that makes McKinley our third U.S. president to be assassinated. You should be able to know the first other two. But that means his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, becomes the next president. Now this is shocking stuff. Teddy was only 42 years old, which means he's our youngest ever president, still holds that record to this day. Now Kennedy, JFK, was our youngest ever elected president, but Teddy Roosevelt was younger when he becomes president of the United States. So, a little bit to know about Teddy. Teddy is truly the most dominant personality of the 20th century, even more than Churchill. He very much believes in bold leadership and thinks presidents should act boldly. So in that mold, some of our more timid presidents who like to talk to Congress, see what they think, what do the American people think, that's not Teddy's leadership style at all. So a president like Jefferson, he would think was very weak and was a bad president. He was too timid or too slow to use action. Teddy is a man of action. Growing up, he was in dozens of fistfights. One of my favorite Teddy Roosevelt stories is once he got in a fight with 3 different lumberjacks all at the same time and beat up them all over some absurd fight about they made fun of the way he talked. So he beat them senseless until they all quit. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, as you can imagine, he wants to be a war president. You've heard of him already about the Spanish-American War and the Rough Riders. In fact, when he leaves office later on, his biggest regret is he presided over 7 years of peace. He desperately wanted to be a war president, but never got the chance. He's going to want to increase the influence and prestige of the United States abroad and spread American values and ideals around the world. He thinks that would improve the world. And one of the big sayings you always associate with Teddy Roosevelt was speak softly, but carry a big stick. We're going to see what that means in a little bit. Here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt. This one person thinks he's like a cross between Daniel Boone and Chuck Norris. And there are parts of that that are a little accurate. So let's keep going. Let's talk about what this big stick means. So this is in reference to his foreign policy. As you can imagine, Teddy Roosevelt very much wants to be a strong foreign policy president. And the first big issue he's going to deal with is the issue of the Panama Canal. Now, a canal has been talked about before. In some of the important books of this chapter we looked at, they talked about the importance of if we have a canal in Central America, then it can reduce the travel time by huge amounts. Thousands and thousands of miles, which you can translate to weeks or even months. Because right now, if you want to go from New York to San Francisco, you can see you have to go all the way down south, below South America, before you can come back. However, if we can build a canal through Central America, it can drastically reduce that travel time. So that can be both for trade reasons, but also for moving military. If you have trouble in the Pacific Ocean and your fleet or you have many battleships on the eastern coast, you need to be able to move those battleships quickly over to the other ocean. So Teddy Roosevelt is a big believer we need to build a canal through Central America. But now there becomes a question of where to build it. Well, there's a few different places in mind of where this canal is going to be built. Eventually, it gets settled on Panama would be the ideal place for this canal. Unfortunately, Panama itself is not a country at this time. Panama was a part of Colombia, and Colombia are being very tough bargainers for the rights for the U.S. to build this canal. They've already started a deal with the French. The French tried to build a canal through this Panama area but failed. The Americans want to basically take over that project, but the Colombians want a lot of money for us to do it. Well, Teddy Roosevelt is not going to take no for an answer. So he's going to come up with a scheme where he basically supports some rebels in Panama to basically rise up against the Colombian government so they can form their own country. The U.S. will support those rebels, and they will be successful. They win their freedom from Colombia, and one of their very first acts as a new independent country of Panama is to cut this deal with the United States for the Panama Canal. And that deal is going to be called the Ay Buenas Varias Treaty. Again, that's probably pronounced wrong, so don't quote me on it. So this is going to be signed between the U.S. and Panama in 1903. Panama will get $10 million plus annual payments of $250,000 a year. And for all that, the USA will get this 10-mile wide strip of Panama to use to build their canal. So now once the treaty is struck, they are ready to get to work on construction. Now construction is going to be a huge, huge ordeal. This is the most expensive construction project in American history to this time. It's going to take a decade. And altogether, it costs about $375 million. And during those 10 years, why is it so expensive? Because it takes a really long time. 20,000 workers, construction workers, were working on this 10 hours a day for 10 years. And that's what it took to finally get it finished. But that canal, once finished, is going to be hugely important for the Americans and will be very much worth all the money they put into making it. It stayed in U.S. control all the way up through the 1970s when Jimmy Carter changes his mind. But we'll talk about that much, much later in the year. Another example of Roosevelt and his foreign policy is the Venezuela debt crisis. Now, we've talked about Venezuela before. Here's another crisis involving Venezuela. Venezuela owes money to Germany. So Germany has blockaded a Venezuelan town and sinks 2 Venezuelan ships. So Germany, they're a new naval power, sent their boats to try to collect on this debt from Venezuela. Americans start to freak out. Teddy Roosevelt gets very nervous that despite Germany saying they have no territorial ambition in Venezuela, Teddy Roosevelt, sees this as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine states, Germany, Europe, you stay over there. America will control this part of the world. So much like McKinley before him, he's going to be tested on how will Teddy Roosevelt react towards the Monroe Doctrine. So Roosevelt will issue his Roosevelt Corollary in 1904. This is basically him strengthening the Monroe Doctrine. This basically says that the United States will do preventative intervention. In the event of any future financial trouble in Latin America, the United States itself would intervene way before any European power could. So European powers cannot get involved. This basically is going to open the door for the U.S. to intervene in Latin and Central America more. It basically declares Europe, stay over there. The United States will be the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. And Europe at the time, basically, they want to avoid a fight with the United States, so they back down. So Monroe Doctrine is strengthened through the Roosevelt Corollary, and the U.S. takes on more responsibility as being basically the empire of the Western Hemisphere. Anything that happens here, the United States will be the one to take care of it. Next up is a cartoon we can see of the Roosevelt Corollary. You see Roosevelt on a big U.S. battleship looking down what looks like a giant gun towards a European monarch trying to kind of redeem his claim on the poor Latin American. In this example, we have Santo Domingo. So it looks like the U.S. is once again protecting Latin America from the greedy Europeans. So this cartoon would be very pro-Roosevelt and saying this is a good thing for Latin America. However, as we are going to see, that's not always going to stay true. U.S. is going to intervene in Latin America a lot soon. So what Latin America thought might have been good for them for a while will quickly turn sour. Here's another very famous political cartoon of this idea of Roosevelt stomping around the Caribbean. He has his big stick. He's carrying a fleet of toy boats, which would represent both the U.S. fleet that they're going to have, and it says various different things on the boats in terms of sheriff, debt collector. Basically, Roosevelt and the U.S., Roosevelt's toy navy, are going to control everything that happens in the Caribbean. He is going to be the one in control. And the last slide for today, let's talk a little bit more about Roosevelt, and let's talk about Roosevelt as a peacemaker. Now, you would think that seems like an odd statement. Roosevelt, not a fan of peace. He wanted to be a war president. However, he will be given this opportunity to be a peacemaker through the Russo-Japanese War. Now, this war, you don't have to know a lot about it, but basically Russia has always wanted a warm water port. and they see an opportunity to have one in a port called Port Arthur. Now, Japan, Port Arthur is very close to them. They don't want Russia and Russian gunships so close to their country. In a preemptive strike, Japan's going to go ahead and attack Russia. A few battles are fought, and then someone reaches out to Roosevelt to make peace. It is disputed if it was the Japanese or the Russians first. You might say, why do these countries want peace after only a few battles? A big reason is the technology involved. This war, the Russo-Japanese War, is basically a pre-runner for World War I. New technologies like the barbed wire and the machine gun are going to be deployed, making each country it's very hard to advance on the other one. They're forced into a defensive war. No one can really get anywhere, so it only makes sense to make peace. So Roosevelt's called in, and he gets to try to be the peacemaker. He's going to get both groups to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. Now, Roosevelt doesn't want either side to get too powerful. Remember, he sees them both as competition and empirical powers. So the agreement that he has them come to, neither side really likes. Neither side gets what they want. So the war is over. Both sides are a little bit more anti-America, but Roosevelt comes out looking like the hero. In fact, he's even given the Nobel Peace Prize, making him the first American president to ever win that. Last up, as an example of Roosevelt being a peacemaker, is the Gentleman's Agreement. Now, one thing that happened in America right now is there's a lot of anti-Japanese feelings. And in fact, they get so high that the San Francisco School Board in California bans pretty much all Asian students from going to regular public school anymore in California. They come down and say all Asian students must go to segregated schools. Now, obviously, the Japanese are not going to take this well. The Japanese government demands that Roosevelt do something about this. Roosevelt, he doesn't want to risk war with Japan, at least not yet, because he doesn't think he's ready. The Americans are ready to take on the Japanese. Japanese are a stronger power at this point. So he's going to work out a gentleman's agreement with Japan. Japan basically will agree to not issue any more passports for any more workers to come work in the United States. And San Francisco will agree to no longer segregate the schools, basically reintegrate the Japanese students with the white students in California. Roosevelt was a big fan of that gentleman's agreement tactic, and we'll talk about him using it as a trust buster later on when we get into the progressive chapter. But that's it for this chapter. Good luck studying, and I'll see you all in class later.